So today we have Professor Ali Maqdam, who works in social and political psychology at Georgetown University, where he is the director of the Conflict Resolution Graduate Program in the Department of Government, as well as the Department of Psychology. He moved to England when he was 8 years old from University of Surrey. He returned to after he got his degree from University of Surrey. He returned to Iran in 1979, the year of the revolution. During his 5 years stay in Iran, he recognized the true limits of the classic experimental laboratory research model. He also had other formative experiences, such as being a journalist and working with United Nations. He went to McGill University in 1984. During this time, his experience in Iran led him to a much more consideration of cultural diversity, cross-cultural psychology, social psychology, and social identity. He left McGill in 1990 for Georgetown University, where he remains to this day. It is customary to read a summary of the guest's works in the field, but it takes too much time to do so when it comes to Professor Mokhaddam's. He has been very prolific. He has published in top tiers social psychological journals, uh, book chapters, dozens books, including The Psychology of Dictatorship, The Psychology of Revolution, Political Plasticity, and How Psychologists Fail. So this is the book that we are going to talk about today. Again, thank you for joining us, Dr. Mughaddam.
Thank you very much. It's my pleasure to be with you.
Okay. So let's jump in about the title. So why did we fail, Dr. Mughaddam? What did we do wrong?
That's an excellent question. And in order to answer it, I think I would go back to 1979 when I returned to Iran. And in that initial first year after the revolution, when we had some extensive freedom, and when women were free and men were free, and the university was extremely exciting, we turned our attention to psychology and what it should be and what it could do for the people. And that question, what can psychology do for the people, stays in my mind and has been with me ever since. And one of my favorite courses is introductory psychology, when we teach students who come with no knowledge of psychology, and we're trying to inspire them and excite them about psychology. And we use these huge texts, which cost hundreds of dollars. They're very glossy, they're very expensive. They take a long time to produce. I know this because I've also produced a social psychology text. And when we look at these texts, one of the problems we have in general psychology is that we find topics such as intelligence, such as motivation, such as human development, such as the cognitive development of babies. We look at these topics and nowhere is there any discussion of social class and poverty. Mm-hmm. It's as if psychology doesn't notice poverty. Yet when we look at the data, when we look at the empirical evidence, we find that poverty has a huge impact on cognitive development, on behavior, on decision-making, on motivation. And so this is one of the areas where I believe we have failed. But the good news is that some psychologists are now attending to this topic. And in fact, I dedicate this book to psychologists who are exploring the impact of poverty and social class on human behavior. So that's one way in which we have failed. A second way in which we have failed, which is also very important, is that we got science wrong. What do I mean by that? In traditional, what I call mainstream psychology, we use a causal model. That is, X causes Y. And the assumption is that we go back to what Aristotle in his time called efficient causation. If X happens, Y happens inevitably. Of course, this is true for some types of behavior, human behavior. For example, I try to play tennis, although my friends would say I play it very badly. Imagine if I play tennis this weekend and I get a bump on the head and it damages some neural circuits, and I get up from the floor and I ask, who I am, where am I, what am I doing here? That is efficient causation. The knock on the head caused me to lose memory for a while at least.
Right.
But most of human behavior is not causally determined like that. It is normatively regulated. For example, if I ask you, by the way, how are you feeling today? How are you feeling?
I'm feeling okay as usual. A little,
Very good.
yeah, yeah.
Okay. Yes. So you could have said to me, mind your own business. I don't want to tell you how I'm feeling. Or you could have said much ruder things,
That's right.
but you didn't.
That's right.
You said what is regular, what is normative for this culture.
That's right.
I remember when I first came over from England to work in America, I just acted the way I'd been trained to act in England. And after a while, one of my senior colleagues said to me, I want to have a chat with you. He said, we're worried about you. You don't seem very happy. And I thought about it and I realized it's the way I react when people ask, how are you doing?
Oh.
Because in England, I'd been trained to say things like, well, I'm hanging in there, head above water, just barely making it. Here in the United States, we have to say, oh, I'm great. I'm
Great.
fantastic. This is just stupendous.
That's right.
And, I'd been trained that if somebody said, I'm great, we would soon put them in their place. You're not great. So these are cultural differences. They're norms that we follow. And the problem is in psychology, we've often mixed up these kinds of behaviors that are normative regulated with causation. And that has led to all kinds of problems, especially when it comes to motivation, especially when it comes to even test taking and these kinds of issues. So the attempt in this book is to really tell psychologists, look, we've done a great job, but we need to attend to poverty. We need to attend to social class. And of course, as you know, in Canada, social class is barely acceptable. In America, it's not acceptable because it's too close to socialism
Socialism. That's
and
right.
communism and all these things.
That's right. That's right. So let me ask another question about the fact that I was watching. I mean, obviously, I read not just this book, but also a couple of other books and some of your articles. And in some of your works, I saw this critique that you level against the mainstream psychology, that it also discounts or ignores the power relations, which I think is, when you mention social class, power relation is already there conceptually. So
Yeah.
can you elaborate on that? And if you could, please, why the psychologists fail to do so? What is it about social class or power relations that psychologists fail to talk about?
Well, we just have to follow one of the principles of psychology, that is, my worldview comes from me and my socialization and my group. And I happen to come from a relatively affluent group and a minority, in the sense of that you and I are among, and probably people listening to us are among, the more elite educated people. The problem comes that we can easily ignore the less educated, and problems arise when we do that in terms of power relations. Now, of course, we can expand this discussion to incorporate resource concentration, because we are at the middle level at the moment, as Thomas Piketty and other economists have demonstrated. Wealth concentration and resource concentration is ongoing, so that now, according to Oxfam and some other sources, about 20 people, 20 billionaires, now own as much wealth as half the world's population. So 20 people are equivalent to about 4 billion people.
That's right.
And that's the kind of inequality I'm pointing to, that we are moving towards greater and greater inequality in wealth and power. And this is also in the area of education, where getting to university and having higher education has becoming more and more expensive, more and more difficult. And in the book, How Psychologists Failed, I review the evidence showing that the best predictor of which university students go to is actually the income of their parents,
In your
at
parents,
least
that's right.
in the United States, the UK, and some other places.
That's right. In the second section of the book, which is called Rethinking Behavior in the Larger World, you talk about mental health and be happy psychology.
Yes.
I think part of it is to kind of criticize this notion of positive psychology, that a lot of positive emotions come from within. We can do this, we can do that, we need to change this, we need to change that in order to be happy. And one of the things that you're trying to do is to say that, hey, the people, the individual is contextualized, as you said, in a social class, in a social context, and there are a lot of variables outside of the individual that determine different variables, including happiness. So in terms of, if we can take that into consideration, give us a little bit of what would be the future psychology look like if we want to incorporate the lessons that you discuss here, what we should do.
Those are excellent points you've highlighted. Let me step back before talking about what we should do. A first point about what we should do is we should be much more aware of the ideologies
Oh,
within psychology.
okay.
We should be much more aware of the ideologies that have shaped psychology.
Psychology.
For example, you alluded to positive psychology. And the positive psychology movement is very strong in the United States, and it is being exported from the United States to many other countries.
That's right. That's right.
Now, what is the ideology behind the positive psychology movement? It is the American dream. It is the idea that anyone can make it. You just have to try hard enough and you have to move yourself. It is individualism and what some have referenced as self-contained individualism. We are self-contained and we can do it. I can do it. If I have a mental health problem, I can fix it. And this resilience that is from within me is the key. And this is very much with line with the American ideology of self-help, individual responsibility, and the American dream.
That's right.
This is a wonderful ideology for mobilizing people, but the problem is if you happen to be one of the billions of people in the world who are at the bottom, we also have to acknowledge that there is a link between poverty and mental health. You know, there's empirical data on this, and even the positive psychologists, I quote them in the book, even the positive psychologists have to admit that if you are poor, you're much more likely to have mental health problems.
That's right. That's right.
When I'm having to think about how do I feed my children, where do I get my next meal from? If that is a stress on my mind all the time, then mental health is going to be a problem.
No problem. That's right.
You know, if I am very affluent, yes, I will have problems because my son or daughter may have so much money, they're going to get into other trouble. You know, they're going to have a therapist and they're going to, you know, all that will happen, but it's a different kind of problem.
That's right. So what you mentioned here, I think it's extremely important because you bring about the concept of ideology into psychology. And most of the time, what we hear in mainstream psychology is that we are scientific, we are value-free, we are neutral, and so on and so forth. And I think what you just alluded to is kind of you saw psychology as a production of a cultural background. So in that case, we cannot say that psychology is a science in a sense that it's neutral, in a sense that there is no connection between psychology and any value. So why we psychologists are obsessed, the mainstream psychology is obsessed with going after natural sciences?
That's an excellent question. And I think this is where we psychologists must put ourselves through therapy. We need therapy ourselves because we have this hang up. We have this problem in that we are obsessed with trying to present ourselves as a science in the most simplistic way. I teach a very unusual course called Psychology and Literature.
Yeah.
And I've written a book called Shakespeare and the Experimental Psychologist. Well, some psychologists who learn about this, they are horrified. They are horrified because they say, look, we've been trying to get away from like Shakespeare and literature and these things. And here you are teaching this stuff. Why do you do this? I also do experimental laboratory work. I publish in that area. but I still think Shakespeare was a brilliant experimental psychologist.
Psychologist.
And I shouldn't be shy about that. I shouldn't be defensive about that. But in psychology, we are defensive. We are very shy about being close to anything like the humanities and literature. Why is this? I think it is a number of reasons. One is material.
Mm-hmm.
See, if I want to get a large grant, the way to do it is to link it to fMRI, link it to whatever I think is scientific at the moment.
That's right.
Just as in the 1920s and 1930s, I would be using the Skinner box. Later on, I would be talking about 1940s. I would be talking about behaviorism, Skinner, Hawthorne, etc. That's where the money would be.
That's right.
Now it is fMRI and brain scanning, etc. So part of the reason is financial, just to get hold of the money. But there's a deeper reason, and that is, I believe it's a misunderstanding of science. And this underlies neuroscience as well. That is a problem we have. We have this urge to get into science and to try to prove things through brain scanning, etc. And this is too simplistic. There's a wonderful book called The Philosophical Foundations of Neuroscience, which should be read by all neuroscientists, but it's seldom read by anybody. And the part of the discussion is about the mereological fallacy, which is very important, as you know.
That's right.
But these things are really not taught because we try to push them away so that we can get our next grant and we can position ourselves as scientific and not raise skepticism in the minds of students. That's
That's
very
right.
important.
That's right. That's right. I assume you maybe because you are a big name in the field, you haven't seen so much, I don't know, backlash from people who root for psychology as a science. But based on my experience, whenever I try to bring up the issue of ideology, the cultural aspect of psychology, the material aspect of psychology, and so on and so forth, then we experience what you just described, that people would be like, my colleagues would be like, hey, what are you doing? You are discrediting the field by saying these things. Can you tell me a little bit about your experience about that?
Yes, my experience is that there is enormous pushback in different ways. And part of it is to ignore your work, to just ignore it, just as critics have been ignored all the time. So that's one strategy, ignoring people. The other strategy is actually censorship.
Oh, wow.
So, depending on what I'm trying to publish, recently I've been publishing on what I call omniculturalism, which argues that as human beings, we should be celebrating our similarities. We are much more similar to one another than we are different.
Different.
So instead of celebrating differences as in multiculturalism, I argue for omniculturalism. And what happens when you submit a paper like this? Well, it gets sent to the defenders of multiculturalism. So I had tremendous trouble just publishing anything on this topic.
I see.
I have a book coming out in a few months on this issue, multiculturalism and omniculturalism, and I present evidence showing that multiculturalism is empirically very weak, But to get this published, you have no idea how many problems I had. Editors would
Interesting.
say, oh, we'd love to publish a book by you. Then they would see it, send it for review. And even when the reviews were positive, they would get feedback on the informal side, telling them this is a problem.
Oh, wow. Wow.
Yeah,
So
so we all have this problem.
okay. Let me rephrase what you described for my audience, and correct me if I'm wrong. I think what you're saying here is that the way in which we produce psychology as a knowledge is shaped by money or financial relationships, is shaped by culture, is shaped by history. So I think that's a crucial point for psychology students to realize that what they see in textbooks, it's a product of a complex processes coming together from different angles: politics, culture, history. And that's the process shaped psychology. So it's not a neutral, value free endeavor that we do. And I think what you did in the book and your other works, which I think is very important, is to acknowledge the fact, this reflexivity that you have in psychology, acknowledge the fact that, hey, we come from a specific background, and this background might influence our work in this way and some other ways that we might not even know yet. I think that's
Yes,
a very crucial point. Yeah.
yes, that's very well put. The psychology that I produce, whether it's laboratory work, my survey work, or it's books, theoretical work, is a product of what I am, and it's manufactured by me in this time from this culture. And for example, the book I just published on revolution, I was shocked to realize that the last book on the psychology of revolution was published by Le Bon in 1894.
Hmm.
Now, why is it that for over 130 years, no psychologist has published on this? Well, because psychology is dominated by Western countries.
Hmm.
These Western countries have not experienced revolution. They're not particularly interested in revolution. It doesn't concern them.
That's right.
Why did it concern me? Because I come from a country that has experienced revolution.
That's right. That's right. Instead of having a book about psychology of revolution, they have a lot of book about persuasion, which
Yes,
which is important for them to in a market economy
exactly.
context to sell a stuff. So that means it's important for me to know how should I do that. So we have a very large body of literature on persuasion. Yeah, that's right.
Exactly.
That's
Yes,
right.
yes.
So what I'm
And
again, another thing that I'm interested in, that you live in America, in the United States,
yes,
and I had this experience numerous times, that when I talk about these topics, the first reaction for some people is that, oh, you're a socialist, communist, and then they disregard the whole argument by just giving me a label. Do you have that experience too?
well, I try to predict and put up a defensive position first.
Oh, okay.
So I position myself, including how I dress, in a very neutral or even conservative way. And in some publications, I've made it clear that, I think that communism is flawed in its psychology. So nobody's going to accuse me of being a communist in that sense,
I see.
especially not when I wear a bow tie.
You need a Che Guevara hat, huh?
Yes, that's right. That's right. However,
Mm-hmm.
if you look at the history of psychology, and this would be a very interesting project for a PhD student or a young scholar, you'll see that in each era, there have been critics of psychology, mainstream psychology. And it's interesting to look to see how they were dealt with and how they were put to the side.
I see.
It is a fascinating question in itself. For example, just a generation ahead of me, critics like Ken Gergen and others before him, the critics of behaviorism that you find in the 1950s, overtaking behaviorism as cognitive science came through. How in each era critics have been dealt with is a very interesting project in itself. But the other issue here is that in each era, we psychologists adopt certain rigid rules and we stick to them as if they are the truth. For example, in the late 1900s, we had introspection and the introspective movement of Wundt and Titchener and others. Then in the early 20th century, radical behaviorism was launched, Watson and Thurston and others. And gradually we get to Skinner's version.
That's right.
Then you see, in each era, they become the truth. In 1930s, behaviorism was the truth. And then in 1960s, gradually cognitive science became the truth. And the truth now is sort of multifaceted more. I think we're in a better era because there are more voices.
That's right.
And because there are more journals that people can publish, they don't have to stick to the mainstream journals.
The mainstream. Yeah, that's right. I think what these days, I completely agree with you that these days we have more voices in the field, no doubt about that. What worries me these days is the appeal of neuroscience in psychology, that they think that the truth lies within the skull. It's the brain that I need to go to.
Yes. Well, again, I would interpret this first through a materialist perspective. Look at the money involved in neuroscience research, the money it can attract. The technology is expensive. Universities love this. Researchers, individual researchers love this because they can get more larger grants. And it looks like what they think is science. So that's the key.
That's right.
Now,
That's right.
I'm sure in another 50 years, we will look back at this era of neuroscience the way we now look back at behaviorism. The time will
That's right.
come.
That's right.
We have to get there.
That's right. I think one of the takeaway from your opinion about the psychology is that the history of psychology matters a lot. And I think one of the problems that we have in universities, I taught at Carleton University in Ottawa, I taught at Australian National University, but history of psychology is a trivial course that people can or cannot, it doesn't matter. It's in the past. We now are much more advanced. You don't need to learn that. I think one of the drawbacks of that type of attitude toward the history of psychology is that we don't know that at different periods in the history we have this idea as truth, but when we moved along, we thought, oh, that was wrong. Now we think, oh, this is the truth. And then after a while, oh, this was wrong. When we don't know that, then we will caught up in the very same issues over and over again.
Yes, I agree. The history of psychology has now become completely marginalized in mainstream psychology. Now, again, to explain this, I would point to American culture. Uh, Back in 1987, I wrote a paper where I described the United States as the first world of psychology, the Soviet Union and other industrialized countries as the second world of psychology, all of Europe, the second world, and the non-Western, non-industrialized world as the third world of psychology. And if you look at exportation, exportation takes place from the United States to the second and third world, and from the second world to the third world. Very, very little is ever moving from the third world to the first world or the second world. And the characteristics of 21st century psychology are basically the characteristics of the United States culture. So this trivialization of history, this looking ahead and not looking back and learning from the past, this is central to American culture.
That's right. That's right. So you suggested that psychologists, fortunately, already started to look at social class, the effects of differential power relations, and its effect on mental health, personality, decision making, and this is one of the right paths that psychologists need to take. You also, in your book, talked about the uh, the changes that we need to make when it comes to research methods.
Yeah.
Can you elaborate a little bit on that? What is it? Experimental method? Some kind of is it? It's not enough. What we should do? What do you suggest here?
Well, a number of things. I'll just mention two. First of all, we should completely rethink the IRB, the so-called ethics review that takes place. And I've discussed at length why I think the IRB is actually unethical. Ethics in psychology should be about the value of the research topic. It is, to me, completely unethical that psychology neglects poverty and social class. Psychology neglects issues such as the concentration of wealth at the moment, the expansive poverty found in all countries, particularly in the United States, the fact that people live with children who have too little food. So this to me is unethical. But if I submit a research proposal to the IRB committee at my university, which I've done regularly, they don't think about the ethics of the topic. They don't say, well, this topic is very trivial. Why don't you study something more important? They're concerned with totally trivial issues, such as, oh, this questionnaire that the participants have to complete, might some of them become stressed out?
That's right.
Well, that's an idiotic question because, first of all, these are volunteers. They're participating in research on a volunteer basis. They can decide not to do it. Second, there's more stress crossing the road than there is doing these kinds of questionnaires typically. So what has happened is that we have trivialized ethics and made it part of the bureaucracy. The IRB committees have become part of the bureaucracy of the university, which in itself is unethical, because there are now, if you look at the top universities, there are now 3 bureaucrats for every faculty member. This is totally unethical. That kind of issue is not discussed by the IRB board. So that's the first thing. The second thing is that because of this hang up we have in psychology for trying to position ourselves as science, and we're very shy about anything that might link us to the humanities, the arts, literature, etc., we stick to quantitative methods only. That's basically what happens. If you look at the mainstream journals in psychology, they don't even publish qualitative data. If you submit even the best qualitative paper to these journals, they'll just reject it outright.
That's right. That's right.
So we need to expand our methodology to include qualitative research, and we should teach qualitative research methods to undergraduates. Actually, those methods are often more useful to them than the quantitative methods. But they should know both. They should know both.
They should know more. Yeah, I agree. I think one of the ways in which we can learn much, much more about people's subjectivities is through qualitative methods instead of quantitative methods. And when we use quantitative methods, we kind of lose a good chunk of subjective experiences that people have. There is a rich data there that you can use by qualitative method. Yeah, that makes sense. Again, for the audience, how psychologists failed from Professor Ali Mughaddam. I really encourage all the students to check out not only just this book, but also another books and articles, because we need more critical perspective when it comes to mainstream psychology. And thank you, Professor, for being with us. If you want to add more to our discussion, if you believe that I should have asked questions that was important, but I didn't, feel free for your chance to add to the discussion.
Thank you very much. Your questions were excellent, and I enjoyed the discussion. I would just say my real name is فتحعلی.
فتحعلی, yes, yes.
So that's important when people are looking up references and things.
That's right, yeah. فتحعلی مقدم.
Yes, and I think you're doing an excellent job. You're filling in a role that needs to be filled, and I hope that you expand your work and talk to more and more psychologists who are willing to be critical and to rethink some of the basic assumptions we have. I believe we have a very good, positive future. Psychology as a discipline is expanding throughout the world. It is expanding fast in China, in India, in all the populous places. My fear is that because of the high status of the United States in terms of being a superpower militarily and psychologically, these other countries are adopting mainstream American psychology without critically thinking about it.
That's right.
I even recently I've been following research in Iran, and it's quite incredible to me that people there are simply replicating things that are being done in the United States.
Yes.
Critical thinking.
I agree with you. I agree with you. To be honest, one of my missions is to build a bridge to fill this gap between at least the critical tradition that we have in Europe and the US and different parts of the world, and introduce critical psychology to Iranian audience. And I had the chance to interview Ian Parker, Thomas Teo, uh, mm, and some other critical psychologists for the audience. And I think, I hope at least, we will be seeing much more work similar to what you did when you wrote the book, The Psychology of Evolution. As you said, it was because of your cultural background that you used your cultural background to add something to this Western psychology. I hope when psychology is spreading through China, India, at least some of those people do the very same thing to bring something in addition to Western psychology that we already have from their culture, their perspective, their history, their concepts, the way in which they view worldview, allow them to have a different perspective when it comes to people's psychology. That's the hope.
Yes, I think that's an excellent point, and it's a message that's worth sending out
Yeah.
from
Yeah.
North America.
Again, thanks to you, and I appreciate your time. I hope we can talk for more in-depth issues in future. I know you're a busy academics, but again, I appreciate your time, and I
Thank you
hope
very
see
much. I
you.
appreciate the opportunity to speak with
Sure.
you, and
Absolutely.
I encourage you to do much more. Wonderful.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Bye bye.